Bandits attack grandmother in front of her grandson. Then a dog did the unthinkable. Alice Montgomery sat in her worn-out rocking chair, the rhythmic creak of the wood blending with the distant hum of cicadas outside. The late summer evening painted the town of Cedar Grove in hues of gold and violet, the last rays of sunlight slipping behind the hills. The small town was known for its quiet charm, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, where children rode bicycles through the streets without fear, and where life followed a predictable, steady rhythm. But lately a strange unease had settled over the town, a whisper of trouble in the air. Alice, with her sharp eyes and the wisdom that came with age, could feel it. Ever since the accident that took her daughter and son-in-law, she had done her best to create a safe world for her 12-year-old granddaughter, Emily. The girl had been through enough, and Alice was determined to shield her from any more heartache. Inside their modest home, Emily sat curled up on the couch, her knees tucked under her chin, a book resting on her lap. She wasn't reading, though. Her gaze kept shifting toward the window, as if waiting for something, or someone. Alice noticed, but she didn't ask. She knew Emily well enough to sense when she was hiding something. The girl had always been strong-willed, a trait she had inherited from her mother, but since the tragedy, she had built walls around herself, retreating into a world of silence and solitude. Alice ached to reach her, to tell her it was okay to feel, to grieve, to let others in. But grief was a stubborn thing. It moved at its own pace, and all Alice could do was be there when Emily was ready. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of time. The scent of fresh baked bread lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy smell of the summer breeze drifting in through the open window. Alice stood and stretched, her joints protesting the movement, before making her way to the kitchen. "You hungry, sweetheart?" she asked, keeping her voice light. Emily shook her head without looking up. Alice sighed softly. The girl had been sneaking out more often, disappearing for hours at a time, returning home with dirt on her clothes and twigs in her hair. Alice suspected she was spending time in the old park near the outskirts of town, a place she had once frequented with her parents before the accident. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Alice sat at the kitchen table, her fingers drumming against the wood. The town had changed in recent months. Reports of petty thefts, broken windows, and strange figures lurking in the shadows had made their way into the hushed conversations at the market and the church. Cedar Grove was not the kind of town where people locked their doors, but lately Alice had taken to double-checking the locks before bed. She had always trusted her instincts, and right now, they were telling her that something wasn't right. And then there was Emily. The girl had always been independent, but her recent behavior worried Alice. She was hiding something, and Alice intended to find out what. The next afternoon, Alice decided to follow her granddaughter. She waited until Emily slipped out the back door before grabbing her shawl and setting off after her, keeping a safe distance. Emily moved quickly, weaving through the familiar streets before heading toward the park. Alice's heart ached at the sight. The park had once been filled with laughter, the sound of children playing, families picnicking under the shade of the old oak trees. But now it stood empty, overgrown with weeds, the swings creaking in the breeze like forgotten memories. Emily made her way to a secluded spot near the edge of the woods, where Alice saw her kneel beside something hidden in the tall grass. Alice stepped closer, careful not to make a sound, until she saw it. A dog. It was a large black dog, its fur matted and riddled with scars. It lay curled up, its ribs visible beneath its thin coat, its dark eyes wary, yet filled with something that looked like hope. Emily reached out, her small hands gentle as she stroked its head, whispering something Alice couldn't hear. The dog didn't flinch, didn't growl. It simply looked at Emily with a quiet trust that made Alice's breath catch in her throat. She had seen that look before, the look of someone who had been hurt, abandoned, yet still yearned for kindness. Emily pulled a small bundle from her bag, bread, pieces of leftover chicken from dinner, and placed them in front of the dog, who hesitated before eating, its movements slow and cautious. Alice watched as Emily sat beside the animal, her fingers brushing against its fur. Her posture relaxed in a way Alice hadn't seen in months. For the first time in a long while, Emily wasn't lost in grief. She was present, alive. Alice stepped forward, making her presence known. Emily stiffened, turning to face her grandmother, guilt flashing across her face. "Grandma," she started, but Alice held up a hand. "How long have you been coming here?" she asked, her voice calm. Emily hesitated before answering. "A few weeks," she admitted. "I found him near the gas station. He was hurt, hungry. I couldn't just leave him." Alice studied the dog, who watched her with quiet intelligence, as if waiting for her judgment. She sighed, crouching down to get a better look. "He's been through a lot," she murmured, more to herself than to Emily. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, but he remained still. "I named him Shadow," Emily said quietly, "because he follows me, even when I don't see him." There was something in her tone that made Alice's chest tighten. Shadow wasn't just a stray dog to Emily. He was something more, something she could pour her love into without fear of losing him the way she had lost her parents. Alice had never been one to take in animals, but as she looked at Emily, at the way she clung to this broken creature with such quiet desperation, she knew there was no choice to be made. "All right," Alice said finally, "but if we're going to do this, we do it right. He needs food, a checkup at the vet, a real place to sleep." Emily's face lit up with a smile that Alice hadn't seen in so long it nearly brought her to tears. "Really?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Alice nodded. "But you have to promise me, no more sneaking around. If we're keeping him, we do it together." Emily threw her arms around her grandmother, squeezing her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Shadow let out a soft huff, his tail thumping weakly against the ground, as if he too understood that he had found a home. As they walked back home, Shadow trailing close behind, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The strange unease in town, Emily's attachment to the dog, the shadows lurking just beneath the surface. Something was coming, and whatever it was, Alice had a feeling that Shadow was going to be at the center of it. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting golden light across the wooden floors as Alice Montgomery poured herself a cup of coffee. The rich aroma filled the room, mingling with the faint scent of the lavender plant that sat on the windowsill. It should have been a peaceful morning, one where she could sit by the table, reading the local newspaper with the occasional glance at Emily as she ate breakfast. But today was different. Today there was an intruder in her home, not one of malice or ill intent, but one of uncertainty and lingering questions. Shadow lay curled up near the back door, his large black body stretched across the floor, his ears twitching at every sound, his deep amber eyes flickering open every few moments, as if he feared this safety was only temporary. Alice watched him from her chair, the rim of her coffee mug resting against her lips, unmoving as she studied the animal that had unexpectedly entered their lives. She had agreed to let him stay, and yet there was something about him that unsettled her, not in a way that made her feel afraid, but in a way that told her this dog had secrets, ones that neither she nor Emily yet understood. Emily, on the other hand, was brimming with newfound energy. The girl practically skipped into the kitchen, her usual sluggish morning demeanor replaced with excitement. She crouched down beside Shadow, running her fingers through his thick fur, whispering to him as if they shared some unspoken language. Shadow lifted his head slightly, his tail wagging just enough to show acknowledgement. Alice sighed, setting down her mug. "Emily, you know we have to take him to the vet today," she reminded gently, knowing full well how stubborn her granddaughter could be when it came to things she cared about. Emily nodded, though there was hesitation in her eyes. "I know," she said softly, "but he doesn't like strangers. He barely trusts us yet." Alice considered that. The dog had been skittish, only truly relaxing when Emily was near. The idea of putting him in a car, taking him somewhere unfamiliar with unfamiliar people, was bound to be stressful, but it had to be done. "He needs to be checked for injuries," Alice said, "and we need to make sure he doesn't belong to someone." The words made Emily flinch, and Alice instantly regretted saying them. The idea of Shadow having another owner meant the possibility of losing him, and Emily had already lost too much. The drive to the vet was quiet, save for the sound of the wind rushing past the car windows. Shadow sat in the back seat, his large frame taking up most of the space, his body tense but unmoving. He didn't whimper, didn't struggle, but his eyes were alert, scanning the scenery as if memorizing every turn, every landmark, every possible escape route. Emily sat beside him, her small hand resting on his fur, whispering reassurances. Alice stole a glance in the rearview mirror, her grip on the wheel tightening. This was no ordinary stray. This was a dog that had seen things, survived things. The vet clinic was a small, welcoming place on the outskirts of town. The sign above the door read, Dr. Samuel Whitaker, DVM, a man Alice had known for years, trusted even. As they stepped inside, the smell of antiseptic and fur greeted them, the faint hum of a radio playing in the background. Shadow hesitated at the threshold, his paws planted firmly against the floor. Alice didn't have to be a dog expert to know that he had been in places like this before, and not all of them had been kind. "It's okay, buddy," Emily whispered, coaxing him forward. Reluctantly, he moved, though his eyes never stopped scanning the room, his ears flicking at every sound. Dr. Whitaker was a kind-faced man in his late 50s, his graying hair neatly combed back, his expression always calm and patient. He greeted Alice with a warm smile before turning his attention to Shadow. "Well now, who do we have here?" he asked, his voice gentle but observant. Shadow didn't growl, but he stiffened, his body coiled like a spring, ready to flee at the slightest provocation. Emily knelt beside him, whispering softly, her fingers brushing against his ear. "His name is Shadow," she said, her voice filled with quiet protectiveness. Dr. Whitaker nodded, crouching to meet the dog's gaze. He didn't reach out immediately, instead allowing Shadow to observe him, to take in his scent, his presence. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, boy?" the vet murmured, as if speaking directly to the dog's soul. The examination was slow, careful. Dr. Whitaker moved with deliberate gentleness, checking Shadow's ribs, his paws, the faint scars hidden beneath his thick coat. He hummed thoughtfully, his brows furrowing in concern. "He's malnourished," he noted, "and these scars, they're old. Some look like they were from fights, others—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Alice understood. These weren't just the wounds of a stray fighting for survival. These were the marks of something worse, a past that had left invisible wounds alongside the physical ones. "He doesn't have a microchip," Dr. Whitaker continued after scanning him. "No collar, no signs of previous ownership that I can see." Emily's shoulders relaxed slightly at that, but Alice could see that the vet's concern hadn't faded. "What is it?" she asked. Dr. Whitaker hesitated before answering. "His demeanor," he said carefully. "He's intelligent, more than your average stray. And his obedience, he's trained, Alice, not just in basic commands, but in discipline. Watch this." He stood up, adjusting his stance, then spoke in a voice slightly firmer than before. "Sit." To Alice's surprise, Shadow obeyed instantly, his movements precise. "Stay." Again, compliance without hesitation. Dr. Whitaker exhaled. This dog wasn't just a pet. He was trained for something. The word sent a shiver down Alice's spine. Emily looked between them, confusion laced with worry. "What does that mean?" she asked. Dr. Whitaker studied Shadow, his gaze filled with something Alice couldn't quite place. "It means he belonged to someone before," he said finally. "Someone who trained him well. But it also means that if he ended up on the streets, something must have gone very wrong." Silence settled over them. Alice's instincts had been right. Shadow carried a past far heavier than any of them had realized. The scars, the hesitance, the sharp awareness of his surroundings. This was no ordinary lost dog. He was something more. And now, for better or worse, he was theirs. As they left the clinic, the weight of what they had learned hung over them. Emily kept her hand on Shadow's back, as if anchoring him to the present, keeping him from slipping into whatever past haunted him. Alice drove in silence, her mind racing. She had allowed him into their home, into their lives, but now she wondered, had she just invited something dangerous into her granddaughter's world? The thought unsettled her, but as she glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing the way Shadow leaned ever so slightly against Emily's side, she knew one thing for certain. No matter where this dog had come from, no matter what he had been through, he wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed Shadow's visit to the vet were filled with an odd sense of anticipation, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Alice Montgomery went about her usual routines, tending to the garden, chatting with the neighbors at the market, knitting by the fire in the evening, but she could not shake the feeling that their lives had taken a turn, one she was not entirely sure she was ready for. Shadow had settled into the house surprisingly well, though his presence still carried an air of mystery. He was not like any dog she had known before. He moved with silent precision, his ears always perked for the slightest sound, his amber eyes scanning his surroundings with a quiet intelligence that made Alice uneasy. He was a protector, that much was clear, but from what, she did not yet know. Emily, on the other hand, was thriving. Ever since Shadow had come into their lives, she seemed lighter, more present. The sorrow that had weighed on her since the accident had not disappeared, but it no longer consumed her. She smiled more, spent less time locked away in her room, and spoke with a warmth that had been absent for far too long. Alice knew it was because of Shadow. The dog had become Emily's shadow in every sense of the word, following her through the house, curling up beside her as she did her homework, sitting at her feet when she read in the evenings. He was her anchor, pulling her back from the loneliness that had threatened to swallow her whole. Alice could not bring herself to resent that, even as the nagging unease in her chest refused to quiet. The first sign that something was truly amiss came late one night. Alice had always been a light sleeper, a habit ingrained from years of motherhood and later from caring for Emily after the accident. So when a faint sound echoed through the quiet house, her eyes snapped open instantly. It was a low growl, deep and guttural, vibrating through the walls. Shadow. The air felt heavy as she swung her legs over the side of the bed, slipping her feet into the worn slippers that rested on the floor. She moved carefully through the darkened hallway, the wooden floor creaking beneath her weight, until she reached the living room. Shadow stood rigid near the front door, his fur bristling, his body tense. His gaze was locked on something beyond the window, something unseen, something that sent an involuntary shiver down Alice's spine. She stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on his back, feeling the taut muscles beneath his coat. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Shadow didn't look at her. His focus remained on whatever lurked outside. Alice's heartbeat quickened as she followed his gaze to the window. The porch light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the yard. But at first she saw nothing out of the ordinary. The street was empty, the trees swayed lightly in the breeze, and the neighborhood was as silent as ever. But then movement, a shadow, no, a figure, just beyond the fence, standing too still, too deliberate. Alice sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her robe. She couldn't make out a face, only the vague outline of someone watching, waiting. Shadow growled again, low and threatening, a sound that sent a jolt of adrenaline through Alice's veins. Whoever was out there must have realized they had been noticed because, in the next instant, they turned and vanished into the darkness, disappearing as swiftly as they had appeared. Alice's breath came fast and shallow as she remained frozen in place, her mind racing with questions. Who had been watching their home in the middle of the night? And why? Shadow's growl faded, but he did not relax, his ears still trained forward, his body still tense. He was waiting, listening. Alice swallowed hard, forcing herself to move. She reached for the locks on the door, ensuring each one was secure, before pulling the curtain shut. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she ignored it. For several minutes, she stood there, her hand resting on the back of Shadow's neck, drawing comfort from the steady rise and fall of his breath. Finally, she whispered, "Come on, let's go back to bed." Shadow hesitated, but eventually followed her, though he did not return to his usual sleeping spot at Emily's door. Instead, he positioned himself near the front entrance, his body stretched across the threshold like a sentry, prepared for whatever danger lurked beyond. Alice didn't protest. If anything, she felt safer knowing he was there. The next morning, Alice debated whether to tell Emily about what had happened. But the last thing she wanted was to scare the girl, especially when Emily had finally begun to find some happiness again. Instead, she kept her worries to herself, though her senses remained heightened throughout the day. Shadow, too, was different. He stayed closer than usual, his movements more alert, his eyes always watching. It was as if he knew something she didn't, as if he were anticipating something coming. The uneasy feeling in Alice's chest grew heavier. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when Emily returned from the store, that the second incident occurred. Alice was in the kitchen, peeling apples for a pie, when she heard the sound of hurried footsteps on the porch. Before she could react, the front door burst open, and Emily rushed inside, her face pale, her breathing uneven. "Grandma!" she gasped, slamming the door shut behind her. "There was a man! He was following me!" Alice's stomach dropped. She set the knife down carefully, moving toward her granddaughter, placing both hands on her shoulders. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. Emily swallowed, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting the man to appear at any moment. "I noticed him near the store," she said. "He wasn't shopping or anything. He was just standing there watching. At first I thought maybe I was imagining it, but then when I started walking home, he followed. Every time I looked back, he was there, always keeping just enough distance." Alice felt her grip tighten slightly. "Did he say anything to you?" Emily shook her head. "Number, but when I turned onto our street, he stopped. He just stood at the corner and watched me walk the rest of the way." Alice exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. Shadow, who had been sitting nearby, let out a low growl, his ears flicking at the mention of the stranger. Alice knew what had to be done. "We're going to the sheriff," she said firmly. "And until we figure out who this man is, you're not walking alone anywhere. Understood?" Emily nodded, still visibly shaken. Alice pulled her into a brief but firm hug before reaching for her coat. "Come on, we're handling this now." As they stepped outside, Shadow following closely, Alice cast a long glance down the street. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the quiet town, but she no longer found comfort in the peaceful evening. Something was wrong in Cedar Grove. Someone was watching, and she had the unsettling feeling that this was only the beginning. The drive to the sheriff's station was filled with a heavy silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on Alice Montgomery like a stone. The sun was setting beyond the hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, but the beauty of it did nothing to soothe her nerves. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap, her small fingers twitching every so often, as if trying to shake off the fear still clinging to her. Shadow sat in the back, his dark amber eyes flickering between them and the passing streets, his body tense, his ears alert. He had sensed something long before Alice had, before any of them had, and she was beginning to think she should have trusted his instincts more. When they pulled up in front of the station, a small brick building nestled between the town's only post office and a bakery that had been there for as long as Alice could remember, she hesitated for just a moment. Cedar Grove was a peaceful town. There hadn't been a real crime here in years, aside from the occasional teenager stealing from the convenience store or old Mr. Jenkins getting caught for fishing without a license again. But things were different now. There were break-ins, strange figures lurking in the shadows, and now a man following her granddaughter home. Alice didn't like coincidences, and she certainly didn't like unanswered questions. With a deep breath, she reached over and gave Emily's hand a reassuring squeeze before stepping out of the car. Inside, the station was quiet, the hum of an old radio playing softly in the background. Sheriff Tom Calloway was seated behind his desk, flipping through a stack of papers, his silver-rimmed glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He looked up as they entered, his brow furrowing slightly at the sight of them. "Alice," he greeted, setting his papers down. "Emily, everything all right?" Alice wished she could say yes. Instead, she pulled out the chair in front of his desk and sat down, motioning for Emily to do the same. Shadow, ever watchful, settled at their feet. "We've got a problem, Tom," Alice said, her voice steady but firm. "Someone's been hanging around our house, watching us, and today a man followed Emily home." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his eyes darkening with concern. "Describe him," he said, pulling a notepad from his drawer. Emily swallowed hard. "He was tall," she said slowly, "wearing a dark jacket. I couldn't see his face very well. He kept his head down. But he was watching me." I know he was. Tom nodded, jotting down notes before turning his attention to Alice. And you said someone was near your house? Alice nodded. Last night. Shadow noticed them first. I didn't get a good look, but there was definitely someone out there. She folded her arms, her expression tightening. I don't like this, Tom. Something's wrong in this town, and I want to know what. The sheriff exhaled through his nose, tapping his pen against the desk in thought. You're not the first person to come in with concerns, he admitted. There have been reports of strangers passing through, people lingering where they shouldn't be. And those break-ins we've had feels like someone's scouting places, looking for something. He looked at Emily, his expression softening. You did the right thing coming here. I'll have my deputies keep an eye out, do some extra patrols near your house. In the meantime, make sure you keep your doors locked. And if you see anything, or anyone out of place, you call me, no hesitation. Alice nodded, the reassurance doing little to settle the pit in her stomach. But she knew Tom. He was a good man, a careful man. If anyone could get to the bottom of this, it was him. Still, as they left the station, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The drive home was quiet, but Shadow remained restless, his large body shifting every so often in the back seat, his ears flicking at sounds Alice couldn't hear. By the time they pulled into the driveway, the sun had disappeared completely, and the porch light cast long shadows across the yard. Alice stepped out first, scanning the street, her nerves still on edge. The town looked the same as it always had, small, quiet, untouched by the kind of trouble that plagued big cities. But now it felt different. There was something lurking beneath the surface, something that didn't belong. Emily was the first to head inside, but Shadow hesitated at the doorway, his head turning sharply toward the far end of the street. Alice followed his gaze, her heart stuttering in her chest when she saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the reach of the streetlight, barely visible in the darkness, watching. She couldn't make out any details, couldn't tell if it was the same man Emily had seen earlier, but every instinct in her body screamed that it was. Before she could react, before she could call out or move toward them, the figure turned and disappeared into the night. Alice's hands clenched at her sides, her pulse pounding against her ribs. This wasn't random. This wasn't some lost traveler wandering the town. Someone was watching them, and she needed to find out why. That night, Alice didn't sleep. She sat by the window, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, her gaze locked on the street outside. Shadow lay beside her, awake, alert. He hadn't settled since they returned home, his body coiled like a spring, waiting for something unseen. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Hours passed, nothing happened, but the feeling remained, the heavy, suffocating sensation that something was coming. Sometime near dawn, Alice finally allowed herself to close her eyes, exhaustion winning over paranoia. But when she woke only a few hours later, she knew immediately that something was wrong. The house was still, too still, the kind of silence that didn't feel natural. Shadow was no longer by the window. Panic sparked in her chest as she stood abruptly, her eyes scanning the room. The back door was open, not wide, just enough to be noticeable, and Shadow was gone. Alice's breath caught as she rushed toward the door, her hands trembling as she pushed it open fully. The yard was empty. No sign of a struggle, no sound of movement, just stillness. Emily's voice came from behind her, thick with sleep. "Grandma, what's wrong?" Alice turned, her pulse hammering. "It's Shadow," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's gone." Emily's face drained of color, her eyes widening with fear. "No," she whispered. "He wouldn't leave. He wouldn't just—" A sound cut through the quiet, a distant bark, low and sharp, coming from somewhere beyond the trees at the edge of their property. Alice's stomach twisted. Shadow hadn't left on his own. Something had taken him, and whatever it was, she knew. It was the same thing that had been watching them all along. Alice Montgomery's heart pounded as she stood in the open doorway, the cool morning air slipping through the gap like a whisper of something gone terribly wrong. Shadow was gone. The door had been left ajar, not fully open, but enough to tell her it hadn't been the wind, hadn't been an accident. Someone had been here. Someone had taken him. The thought sent a shiver through her spine, colder than any winter frost she had ever felt. Emily stood behind her, bare feet on the hardwood floor, her wide eyes filled with panic. "He wouldn't just leave, Grandma," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would make it all the more real. He wouldn't. Alice knew that. Shadow was many things: cautious, alert, loyal, but he was not reckless. He would never wander off, not after everything, not after the way he had been watching over them like a silent guardian. If he was gone, it meant someone had taken him, and that meant they were in more danger than she had realized. Alice grabbed her robe tighter around her as she stepped onto the porch, her bare feet cold against the wood. The sky was still tinged with the soft gray of early dawn, the town still asleep, unaware of the storm brewing beneath its peaceful surface. She scanned the yard, looking for any sign of movement, any clue as to where Shadow might have gone. Nothing. No paw prints, no broken branches, no sound except for the distant chirping of birds waking to a new day. And then, faint but unmistakable, a bark. Not frantic, not pained, but calling. Emily bolted past Alice before she could stop her, racing toward the edge of their yard where the trees thickened into the start of the woods. "Emily, wait!" Alice called, her heart lurching as she hurried after her. The girl didn't stop, didn't hesitate. Shadow was out there, and nothing would keep her from finding him. Alice's breath came in sharp bursts as she followed, the damp grass cool beneath her feet, the morning mist curling between the trees like ghostly fingers. Another bark echoed through the woods, this time slightly closer, urging them forward. They pushed through the underbrush, twigs snapping beneath their weight, leaves rustling as they brushed past. Alice's pulse hammered against her ribs as she struggled to keep up with Emily's desperate pace. The girl was moving on instinct alone, driven by something deeper than fear. Something that told her she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Shadow needed her. Another bark, just ahead. This time it was different. Sharper, edged with warning. And then they saw it. A clearing just beyond the trees, bathed in the dim glow of the rising sun. Shadow stood in the center, his body tense, his head low, his dark fur bristling. He wasn't alone. A man stood a few feet away, half hidden by the shadows of the trees, his stance unreadable. Alice's breath caught in her throat as she grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her back. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched them, as if deciding something, weighing a choice. Shadow let out a low growl, his muscles coiled, ready to strike if needed. Alice's voice was steady, but sharp. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if surprised she had spoken first. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the morning haze. His hands were in his pockets, his posture too casual for someone who had just been caught trespassing. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth, almost amused. "You've got a good dog," he said. "Trained well." Alice's grip on Emily tightened. "That doesn't answer my question." The man exhaled, as if debating whether he wanted to entertain the conversation at all. Then slowly he took a step closer. Shadow's growl deepened, his stance shifting ever so slightly, a warning that he wouldn't hesitate to attack. The man stopped. "I was just curious," he said. Didn't mean to scare the girl. His tone was light, but Alice wasn't fooled. There was something behind it, something calculating. She squared her shoulders, her voice unwavering. "You were watching our house. You followed my granddaughter." The man didn't deny it. Instead, he smiled, a slow, knowing expression that made Alice's skin crawl. "You should be careful who you let into your home," he said, his eyes flickering toward Shadow. "Not everything lost is meant to be found." And then, as if deciding the conversation was over, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees as silently as he had come. The clearing felt colder in his absence, the tension lingering like a stain in the air. Alice let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding as she pulled Emily closer. Shadow finally moved, his growl fading as he trotted toward them, nudging Emily's hand with his nose. Emily dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around his neck, her shoulders shaking. "I thought you were gone," she whispered. Shadow let out a soft huff, as if to say he would never leave her. Alice's mind raced. That man, who was he? What did he want? His words, cryptic as they were, made it clear that this wasn't a coincidence. He knew something about Shadow, about his past, and that meant this wasn't over, not by a long shot. By the time they made it back to the house, the sun had fully risen, casting light over the streets of Cedar Grove, making everything look normal again. But Alice knew better. She locked the doors, double-checking the windows, making sure everything was secure before sitting Emily down at the kitchen table. The girl was still shaken, her hands gripping Shadow's fur like he was the only thing keeping her grounded. Alice took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. "We need to be smart about this," she said, her voice firm. "That man, he wasn't just some drifter. He was looking for something, and I have a feeling it has to do with Shadow." Emily lifted her head, her eyes filled with worry. "What do we do?" Alice didn't have an easy answer. She had spent her life protecting Emily, but this was something bigger than both of them. This was a threat that had crept into their lives without warning, and she had no intention of letting it take root. "We stay alert," she said. "We don't go anywhere alone, and we figure out exactly what Shadow's past is before someone else does." Emily nodded slowly, determination creeping into her expression. Shadow remained beside her, his dark eyes steady, unwavering. Alice reached over, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. "We're going to be okay," she promised, though deep down she wasn't sure if she believed it, because the man's words still echoed in her mind, chilling in their simplicity. Not everything lost is meant to be found. And she couldn't shake the feeling that they had just stepped into something far bigger than they had ever imagined. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of unease and whispered fears. Alice Montgomery kept the doors locked, checked the windows twice, and kept Shadow inside the house despite his clear frustration. The tension in the air was thick, pressing against her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. Emily hardly left Shadow's side, her fingers tangled in his fur whenever she sat, her eyes darting toward the windows whenever a shadow moved outside. The man's words echoed in Alice's mind on an endless loop. Not everything lost is meant to be found. She had lived long enough to know a warning when she heard one, and if he thought that scaring her would make her give up, he was wrong. She was going to find out the truth. Late that night, after Emily had finally fallen asleep on the couch with Shadow curled beside her, Alice sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards settling, the wind rustling through the trees outside. The man had known something about Shadow. That much was clear. And if there were answers, she had a feeling they weren't going to come from the sheriff. Tom Calloway was a good man, but he had dismissed her concerns too easily, chalking it up to strangers passing through town, a bit of bad luck. No, Alice needed to dig deeper. She needed to think like the man who had been watching them. Her eyes drifted to Shadow's still form, his chest rising and falling steadily as he slept beside Emily. He was a mystery, a ghost of another life. The scars along his side told a story of hardship, of battles fought, but they also told a story of survival. He wasn't just some stray. He had belonged to someone once, and if that man's warning was any clue, someone dangerous. Alice grabbed her laptop from the side table and opened it, the blue light casting shadows on her face as she typed "missing black dogs" into the search bar. It was vague, but it was a start. She scrolled through pages of lost pet reports, adoption centers, none of them matching Shadow's description. With a sigh, she tried again. This time she added trained dog found and military or police K9 missing. The results shifted, and then she saw it. A news article, dated almost a year ago. Former K9 disappears from training facility. Believed stolen. Alice clicked on the link, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned the details. A highly trained dog, a black German Shepherd mix named Rex, had vanished from a private security firm in the city. The article mentioned suspicions of theft, but no leads had ever been found. No suspects, just a dog that had disappeared into thin air. Alice's hands shook as she stared at the screen. Shadow, Rex, wasn't just a stray. He had been taken from somewhere, from someone, and now that someone wanted him back. She barely had time to process it before Shadow's head snapped up, his ears alert. A second later, there was a noise outside, the unmistakable sound of a car engine idling just beyond the house. Alice's heart slammed against her ribs as she shut the laptop, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Shadow was already on his feet, his body tense, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Emily stirred at the sound, her sleepy voice barely a whisper. "Grandma!" Alice moved quickly, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder as she gestured for her to stay quiet. "Someone's outside," she murmured. The girl tensed but nodded. The car engine cut off, then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Alice's fingers curled around the edge of the kitchen counter, her mind racing through options. Call the sheriff? No, they wouldn't make it in time. Run? No, they wouldn't get far. And then she realized, the door, the same door Shadow had been taken through, had it been left unlocked again? She didn't have time to check. A knock. 3 short raps against the wood. Not urgent, not rushed, just patient. Waiting. Shadow moved first, stepping between Alice and the door, his growl deepening, his entire body rigid with warning. Alice swallowed hard, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. "Who's there?" Silence. Then the voice. Smooth, controlled. The same man from the woods. "You have something that belongs to me." Alice's grip tightened on Emily's shoulder, her pulse pounding in her ears. She forced herself to stand tall, to keep her voice even. "I don't think so." A chuckle. Low, almost amused. "Let's not play games, Mrs. Montgomery." He knew her name. That alone sent ice through her veins. "I just want the dog. Give him to me, and I'll leave." Alice's stomach turned. She had no doubt in her mind that if she handed Shadow over, they'd never see him again, and not in the way of a lost pet finding its rightful owner. No, this man wasn't a former handler looking for his K9. This was something else entirely. Shadow was valuable, trained, and this man wasn't here to reunite with an old friend. He was here to reclaim stolen property. Alice's voice was sharp. "You need to leave." A pause. Then the sound of a hand pressing against the door, testing the lock. "That's disappointing," Shadow snapped. A deep, savage snarl ripped from his throat, his body launching forward before Alice could stop him. His teeth slammed into the door, his claws scraping against the wood as he barked furiously, the sound so vicious, so full of warning, that even Alice felt a jolt of fear. The man outside took a step back. "Hm," he murmured. "So you're still in there, aren't you, boy?" Alice didn't wait for his next move. She grabbed the shotgun from the cabinet above the fridge, a relic of her late husband's, long untouched but always loaded. She cocked it, the sound ringing out like a promise. "I said leave." For a moment, nothing. Then the soft sound of retreating footsteps. The man didn't rush. He didn't run. He just left. Alice waited, her breath shallow, listening as the car engine rumbled back to life and slowly disappeared down the road. Only then did she exhale, her hands still shaking. Emily let out a small sob, burying her face into Shadow's fur. He licked her hand gently, still standing guard, still waiting. Alice knelt beside them, running a hand over Shadow's back. "We're not safe here," she whispered. She knew it in her bones. Whoever that man was, he wasn't finished. And if he came back, he wouldn't knock next time. They had 2 choices, wait for him to strike again or disappear before he could. And Alice had already made her decision. By morning, they were packed. The car was loaded, Emily in the passenger seat, Shadow curled up in the back. Alice took one last look at the house before putting the car in drive. They weren't running. They were protecting what was theirs. And if that man wanted Shadow back, he would have to catch them first.